Does Sega hate women? The Game Apologist would have you think so based on his observations of the way that super and/or hyper forms are handled in Sonic Origins. However, today we are going to debunk this claim from a few different angles, starting with identifying what Nick got wrong. And this is totally aside from his opinion, but what factual things did he trip up on that may have in part led to his faulty conclusions? After that, we will touch upon a few different ways that the current configuration of how Amy is handled is most certainly justified by precedence and decency. And finally, I will be issuing Nick the Game Apologist his sentencing, what he will need to do to atone for this situation. So the basic premise that led Nick the Game Apologist to these conclusions is that in the original game Sonic 3 and Knuckles, Tails could only go super, no matter how many emeralds he collected. He can't go hyper. Okay, but then Sonic Origins rolls around, and people were amazed to discover on release day, Tails could actually go hyper and become Hyper Tails, technically. And I say technically because really what we're talking about in this moment is just literally the word changing. It was only ever called Super Tails in the original game, even with all the birds cycling around him. But Sonic Origins debuts, and now it says Hyper Tails, right? So for the lore-inclined, lore enthusiasts very rightly had a field day with this. It was a big deal. Tails can go hyper now, which is all well and good. So a little bit more time passes, and pretty soon it's time for the Origins Plus expansion. And we find out that Amy is going to be in the game, but once the game becomes available to us, people went in, played as Amy, collected all the super emeralds, and found the on-screen notification upon collecting that 14th emerald, in fact, just says, now Amy can become Super Amy, not Hyper Amy. So even though Tails was able to get that hyper status on the day that Sonic Origins first released, Amy goes through all the same things, gets her upgraded abilities with the more hammer throws, and yet she's just Super Amy, not Hyper Amy. Which on the surface would mean that Amy and Tails don't have parity. If they're collecting all the same things, shouldn't they be afforded the same rewards, the same abilities, the same contribution and participation in the group's adventure? The main thing to point out right off the bat is that, sure, you could point to the discrepancy, like, how come in Origins Tails can be Hyper Tails but not Amy? What is that, a preoccupation with the male hedgehog's lore, stipulation, caveat? Well, as a starting point, there's right off the bat a massive twist to this situation that the Game Apologist overlooked. Because you see, once the game was updated, and it's not only in the Plus expansion, it also was patched in to the version of the game for people that did not make the $10 plunge to get that expansion DLC. The base game was similarly around that time, I think it was the 2.0.0 patch edition. They reverted Tails back to now the text upon collecting the 14th emerald only says Super Tails, which from that point on became consistent with Amy's outcome, which is that she collects all 14, the text only says Super Amy. So the fact of the matter is, upon the release of Origins, plus, well, now Tails and Amy are on pretty much a level playing field, but the Game Apologist was so preoccupied with not seeing that hyper designation on Amy, I guess the circle of homies in his community, right? None of them had the field research, intel reconnaissance to figure out that, well, actually, there was never a day where Tails was afforded a hyper designation that Amy was not. And so that makes you think that, well, what was the word hyper doing in there for Tails when the vanilla game came out? And that could very basically be as simple as the Sonic 3 Origins devs over at Headcanon -CW, they just went ahead and did it. They gave Tails that hyper designation, saying to themselves, well, he got the Super Emerald, so he should be able to go hyper, right? It's a small enough detail that I could imagine that getting kind of snuck past Sonic Team, or it just didn't come up. So even without this very important data point missing, it's still worth a meditation on why Sonic Team goes about this topic the way they do, and what realistic practical societal factors could explain the very deliberate and purposeful way that Iizuka and company go about this. But even armed with this misinformation, Game Apologist on many occasions came out guns blazing, saying to us, "I'm sorry, but it's just weirdly sexist." And you look at the exact quote of that, to say, "I'm sorry, it's just weirdly sexist." Well, Nick, the fact that you're apologizing pretty much indicates that you know that there's something not quite right with this situation, that you are bringing in your emotions to this situation in a way that you need to proactively apologize to your viewers. So right off the bat, there's a very straightforward reason not to just be handing out the hyperforms like Halloween candies, in that overusing the hyperforms would very much cheapen the experience and the impact of the regular superforms. I say regular, but it's because we need that to be a big deal. We don't want the hyper status to be now cheapening and making the baseline superform feel unremarkable. Like, you go to see Sonic Movie 3 on the big silver screen and you see Super Sonic, and it's a big deal. He's in Sonic Movie 2 as well. But imagine how much that epic cinematic event would have been undercut if I'm sitting there in the theater looking at Supersonic voiced by Ben Schwartz and saying, how can I really get hyped about this if I know that Hyper Amy is waiting at home for me? Keeping Amy out of the hypersphere as itself is perfectly logical because, for one thing, she was not there for the original game. I think it's widely understood that Amy's participation in Sonic Origins Plus is essentially a non-canon, let's have fun type of deal. I think that Iizuka and maybe some of his Sonic team compatriots are, if you can wrap your head around this, folks out there listening to me, interested in protecting the character of Amy, not eroding her character, not diluting the way that she factors into all of this. I mean, it came from the mouth of Babes himself. Nick, the game apologist, goes, well, if Amy has all these powerful hammer techniques, then how could Metal Sonic have even captured her at Collision Chaos in the original Sonic CD? And it's like, well, game apologist, little do you know you are actually onto something. Overpowering Amy with all these abilities is going to take away and retroactively nullify the very basic human hedgehog story in Sonic CD. The damsel is captured, and Sonic's got to get her back. So yeah, it's easy to imagine Iizuka sitting there and be, yeah, if we just throw around these hyperforms, it will undercut the dramatic energy that happened in Sonic CD. In these criticisms, the game apologist, not only throws around accusations of sexism that are unfounded based on the Origins Plus full patch, game apologist further projects these theories to say that, Sega doesn't want to give Amy these equal hyperforms because Sega is embarrassed by the extended cast. And it's like, no way, Brohan Santana. They are not embarrassed by Amy. They want to protect and preserve Amy's relevance within the canon, within the whole story and lore's internal logic. So they are not hiding Amy. They are protecting her, protecting lore. They are making a concrete decision not to cheapen their characters, despite any number of protests and backlash that they continue to get on Twitter. I mean, so Nick is sitting in his philosopher's chair as the game apologist and looking at this decision to keep Amy on the sidelines from the hyper events, even though, as of that point in time, Tails was similarly barred from enjoying the hyperform status. Nick says, I just feel like this was management's call. You just feel that? Isn't it wicked obvious? Isn't this Iizuka's very deliberate and purposeful choice? There's no mystery that Nick is solving by, I just feel like deep down this has got to be management. It's like, yeah, no kidding, bro. Management's call is to reject the mob's insistence that Amy should just be given a hyperform like a Halloween candy. Management is actually showing what we call a spine, right? Showing some bravery by holding their line. So for Nick to tell Sega, stop being scared, like that's a fanfic that he's written and it's enjoyable to watch and listen to. And if we're still fretting about Amy and Tails and whether they're given their rightful due, Well, just remember that even in the original game, Sonic 3 and Knuckles, Tails' playthrough is not canon. Sonic and Knuckles' playthroughs are the only canonical playthroughs. There's Sonic fighting all the Robotnik bosses in each level, and then there's Knuckles' playthrough where now Floating Island has returned to the sky because you can't see the ocean at Angel Island Zone right off the bat. And then Knuckles fights Egg Robo. So right off the bat, you know that Tails' playthrough is not canon because he's just fighting Eggman and all the same bosses in the same order. You know, realistically, in real life, there would be no practical reason for Eggman to return to his old machine. He would have to rebuild each of his boss machines, including the Carnival Night boss, to name a one. So if Tails' playthrough is not canon, even the original game, well, okay, this is Sonic Origins Plus. Who knows if they even had a plan to add in Amy when they first made Origins, or was that just something that was brainstormed and implemented at some point in the year between Vanilla Origins and Origins Plus? So if they're just going to throw Amy in the game for fun and to get some female inclusion, they just put Amy in the game and didn't overthink it. Let's not just hand out the hyper designation since she wasn't there in the Hidden Palace in 1994 when it actually happened. When you think about the fact that Sega has largely strayed away from implementing or even acknowledging the hyperforms in any other games after the original Sonic 3 and Knuckles, well then a deep lore specialist could sit there and figure, okay, maybe that's basically Sega's way of saying that the hyperforms aren't as canonical, which is to say, if Sonic 3 and Knuckles came out as one game as originally intended and was not split in two due to the Happy Meal incident, if all of Sonic 3 and Knuckles was in one cartridge, you know, I guess we'll never know for sure, but would it have only had one set of emeralds and one transformation mechanic? Perhaps the way it shook out was that they wanted Sonic 3 standalone to have its own emerald system, and then once you got to the second half of the game and Sonic and Knuckles, they wanted to raise the stakes a bit, saying, well, what's the point of collecting all these emeralds again just to get the abilities that we had before? So you could reasonably suggest that the hyperforms itself are really just a gameplay conceit that stemmed from the immediate business need to give the player a little bit more, so they didn't feel like they're shelling out $60 collecting all this new set of super emeralds just to get the same form back. So if the hyperform itself is just a non-canon bonus that directly stemmed from the game being split in two per McDonald's, well then yeah, you bet that there's going to be a reason to keep Amy out of that odd limbo zone of non-canonality. And so we can look at Vanilla Origins having Hyper Tails listed in the text upon collecting all 14, right? It's a plausible possibility to consider that that was just the headcanons team doing. They did it out of wish fulfillment. They did it because maybe they are part of the Game Apologist mob that has been demanding for such character ability upgrades and title recognition. Now, one of the things Iizuka has mentioned time and time again is that only male hedgehogs can enjoy these benefits. Hedgehogs with benefits. Nick concedes that he would be maybe okay with this if this premise was specific to Sonic, Shadow, and Silver, that would be a more tangible, plausible, lore-related thing, but without linking it to those three specific hedgehogs, Nick the Game Apologist is just, give her the same title as the boys, come on. Well, hold on. Game Apologist, have you never heard of Ladies' Night? Are you going to now file a petition to end Ladies' Night, right? Gender inequality is a thing. It's a mechanic at some restaurants. Need I remind you of the age-old tagline, cute couples get in free? And I hate to deliver this dose of a reality check, but the Catholic Church has rules about priests, right? As of 2025, if you want to be a priest in the Catholic Church, you better be a man. Because if you're not a man, they will turn you down at the door of the seminary in a bit of the same way that they will do so for Amy and the hyper thing. So the Game Apologist would have you think, although he just didn't check the patch when Origins Plus was granted to us. So I would just say that if the Game Apologist wants to pick such a fight with the way that sex is handled throughout the genders in the hedgehog content, Well, maybe there are some higher stakes settings in which this gender disparity would deserve a bit more attention. So if you have all these other examples of gender disparities highly ingrained and built in to long-standing traditions, I'm not saying that the long-runningness of a tradition justifies it, just to say that any ounce of this that makes its way into a Sonic Hedgehog game, it's not existing in some kind of vacuum. It's part of a larger societal equation, for better and worse, but there's nothing uniquely outrageous or inappropriate about how gender is handled in Hedgehog content compared to the real world. Nick doesn't even stop there. I'm not going to use the graphic word that he did. I'm going to use the word rod, because I like that euphemism a whole lot better. Nick the Game Apologist says, why is it that only hedgehogs with rods can glow yellow? And then Game Apologist puts forth the very fallacious appeal inquiry. He says, why do genitals make a difference? Whoa, time out, slowed down, writing you a speeding ticket. So you think that genitals are actually the sole, right? If you have a chart of hedgehogs, look at these hedgehogs and identify which components will or won't allow a hedgehog to go super. Well, Nick Apologist would take his magnifying glass and point only at that little area in between the legs. But sweetheart, there is so much more in the body of what a man is or a woman is outside of that area, but it's baffling that you would point specifically at someone's genitals and say, like, that's what makes them a woman. Sugar, when we're talking about the differences between men and women, you need to open up that magnifying glass to the entire bodily structure. We're talking about drastically different amounts of muscle mass, bone density, to say nothing of how the brain is structured differently in a man versus a woman. Have you ever seen one of those TikTok videos that tells you a man's brain is wired to make him think about sex every X amount of seconds, right? Spoiler alert, when you look at that same stat in women, it's different. Nick Apologist, hormones travel all throughout a human's body, and those hormones are going to be drastically different depending on their genetic blueprint. The differences between men and women that might affect the fact that they can go super or not also comes down to some of the smaller details, like an Adam's apple. Women generally don't have them, and they can serve as an extra line of defense in combat. So I'm not just this guy that's ready to promote women to the front lines because inclusion, but that if Amy's bodily structure is unprepared to cope with the intense, very specific energy forces brought about by the Chaos and Super Emeralds, I just don't want Amy to suddenly, have her muscles rip apart, because equality, if she's not built for it, let's save her from that agony. The idea that the super abilities would be closely tied to male hedgehogs makes even more loristic sense when you think about the Hidden Palace mural, right? If I need to catch some of the more casual Sonic fans up on this right now, I will. Quick recap. A good long while ago, Gerald Robotnik went to Angel Island and looked closely at the mural at Hidden Palace Zone. And so everything that he learned that day and, reversed engineered the design of Shadow by looking at the phenotype portrayed on that very important mural that you see above the Knuckles fight in Sonic 3 and Knuckles, use the depiction of that phenotype to reverse engineer the genotype that closely matches Sonic, and as an extension of that would be eligible for emerald powers and transformations. So as we wind this down and connecting it to just the larger topic of gender relations here on planet Earth, for Nick Apologist to be baffled by so much of what's going on and what he perceives to be going on in its game, it's like, why are you so completely shocked by this? You could go to any number of restaurants that say, cute couples get in free, ladies' night on Tuesdays, free drinks. I think if the Game Apologist truly wants to make a case that there needs to be more gender equality in Sonic, well, he should start that conquest by turning around and addressing it in the real world first. So basically, the game apologist, if he's having such a motive to speak up on this as if he's the hero that's going to help move gender equality in a better direction, well, I would say if we are to just hand out gender equality in the games without earning it in the real world, well, then young girls are going to grow up seeing Amy with complete parity with the boys. She can go super hyper, all of this stuff. And it's going to give that young upcoming generation of girls, a fake mistaken impression that, oh, when I see a girl in a video game go super, that tells me, right? And that is, you are not preparing said young girl for the real world. She's going to be lulled into a false sense of, equality being bound, and then she's going to hit up against a brick wall when she enters the workforce. So, game apologists, please don't set up the next generation of young girls to slam into a brick wall like this. We need to prepare gamers of all ages for the reality of the world that they will inhabit. And so the much higher priority of gender discrimination should first be in the real world. And it's not even only a matter of discrimination, it's all just about double standards. I mean, even the most wokest, liberal, social justice sweethearts would still nonetheless subscribe to some double standards between men and women. I mean, let's say I, as a man, go on a date, multiple dates with a lady, and then, after going through a few dates, you start to talk about, how the first few dates went, and this woman discloses that she thinks that the man should pay for the first date and the second and third. And, wow. So you just think that it's an expectation that the man ought to keep paying, certainly for the first date, but really he should even kind of keep going past that first date. Furthermore, this same lady would be of the impression that it should always be the guy who asks the girl, to go on another date. One should never expect the female to initiate any of those plans of the sort. Furthermore, as an extension of that, this very same woman who represents modern, liberal, equality-minded ideals would then go so far as to say, yeah, and the first kiss, you as the man, you should initiate that, right? So at every step of the romantic courting process, the man takes the lead, and then the woman, makes a decision to go along with it if it is to her liking. So if in 2025, a great many women in 2025 still fully subscribe to these double standard expectations that the man should do X, the woman should... Okay, but here's the massive problem. If you are going to defend and continue championing this imbalanced gender dynamic, well then are you going to turn around and go to work and just magically snap your fingers and suddenly everyone's on an equal playing field, right? If you are aggressively demanding that the man take the lead, the man show all the bravery and take all the risk and call the shots, well, why are you baffled that then you wake up the next morning, go to work, and when a woman tries to negotiate a raise, it doesn't go as well? When she tries to speak up in a meeting, she's seen as, speaking out of turn, right? Whether or not she actually is speaking out of turn, perhaps it's the double standard of men and women's behavior that you think is just going to up and disappear the minute you set foot at work, but that's unrealistic. Anyone who wants these across-the-board equality stats for men and women, equality of opportunity, equality of the outcome, how much money did you pay for a ticket to go see Ghostbusters 2016? And how did that work out for you? I think that in the 2010s, there was a big movement to import women, give you the women version of everything, Ocean's 24. It's 2025. How did that work out? Maybe these artificially constructed scenarios that artificially promote women to the positions that were traditionally carried out by men, the men who are expected to show all the bravery, take all the risks, and take all the initiative, maybe those standards that you still want men to adhere to make putting women in the lead of a combat film sometimes a little bit implausible. It's hard to sell the veracity of that. It takes you out of the movie to see Captain Marvel put up her dukes and punch this guy and that guy and knock them out instantly. When the movie's over, we're back at home, And it's right back to the age-old ancient expectations of men do this, women do that. So actually the double standard that the game apologist is tripping himself into is the double standard of wanting boys and girls to have complete equity here in the video game, but he doesn't seem to be concerned about that in the real world. I would say for the game apologist to even have a ground to stand on, to file a complaint about Sega, even going so far as to say that they are sexist or hate women, I would say the game apologist should first reach out to the Catholic Church and get them to reconsider their policy about only men can be priests. Sega has made a deliberate choice, ignoring the pressure of the mob, not to promote underqualified women just for the sake of fulfilling a quota, ticking off a box, giving equality and justice for all, regardless of lore or backstory or super emerald mechanics. Because when you promote underqualified women for the sake of a quota, you are actually very badly hurting women. You think you are helping them in the short term because they need the extra leg up, because they're disadvantaged in the workforce at this point in human history, but as well-meaning as that might be, it actually damages women's participation in the workforce in the long term, because when you promote underqualified women in this way, well, they're not ready for the job that you're putting them into. And because they're not ready for it, because they lack the prerequisite baseline skills and resume and expectations, you're just saying, we need to put a woman here, we need a certain amount. Well, now you're going to have women doing a bad job. Not because women are bad at jobs, but because you went out of your way to get someone on the basis that are women, regardless of how qualified they are. So when you do this, you're going to have statistics collecting at this workplace or that workplace. If it's a sales job, and you look at, the dashboard on the intranet system, you can see the customer satisfaction rating for every employee in the company. You can see the overall sales volume for every employee in the company. And if you see a handful of women that are way, way below the average worker at the firm, well, if you don't know any better, you're going to incorrectly conclude that, women are bad at jobs. It's confirmed, because look how low their stats are in the system. The low stats in the system are not there because women aren't good at this or that job, but because they have been promoted before they're ready for prime time. Of course they're going to do a worse job, and people will incorrectly attribute to their poor performance to being female. So really that's just perpetuating stereotypes. And I refuse to do that in real life or in my hedgehog content. So with all that said, we have now arrived at the final sentencing. I am now going to sentence Nick and specify what needs to be done in order for him to atone for this situation. And so on a basic level, what this sentencing is for Nick to just make a new video on the topic, because the 2 videos that he's made on the topic are obsolete and incorrect. In fact, the second video even has an on-screen meme visual gag bit calling out the fact that his first video about the super situation with Amy is now null and void and obsoletized. But the very unfortunate irony with this is that that video itself is also outdated and obsolete the day it was uploaded, because Nick the Apologist did not know that when Amy was added to Sonic Origins Plus, they simultaneously updated the game so that Tails is only Super Tails in that text that shows up at the Hidden Palace upon collection of the 14 emeralds, and thus, if we're lasering in on that one specific data point, Tails and Amy both only ever go Super. So the Game Apologist, I quite look forward to your follow-up video that will undo the very unfortunate research negligence that you did in your most recent Amy video, which, we can joke about hedgehogs, but this serious lack of attention to detail led Nick Apologist to make very charged claims about Sega hating women. Brah, it's so much more nuanced than that. A male hedgehog rule is perfectly fine for a great many reasons we've specified. And I look forward to the Game Apologist video. Seek out his channel, like and subscribe.